But we're going to talk about transforming the mind, which is what I talked about last time. That was part one, and this is now part two. So I was taken by this part of this book by His Holiness that talks about transforming the mind, and he talked about two different things that we can actually see in our own experience that let us know that this is possible. And that's the first one I talked about last time, which was this fundamental law of impermanence. Even if you tried to hold a state of mind, it would change. It's changing as it's arising. So that's what we talked about last time. And now to go on, let's just clarify again what it means to transform our mind. And this is something that we do, an endeavor that we do in order to enhance our good qualities, essentially, by making our constructive and virtuous thoughts and attitudes more forceful. And we diminish our non-virtuous and destructive thoughts and emotions by counterbalancing them. Some with positive thoughts. There's many ways to go about this, but that's essentially what transforming the mind refers to. And he had said that the connotation of the word dharma in Tibetan, which is true, has the connotation of transforming. So in this way, he's saying that we transform our mind from one that's undisciplined. Doesn't it feel that way? It does to me. Especially when my mind is stirred up about anything, very undisciplined, I can't control it, to one that's disciplined. So that's what we're trying to do. And the second idea, the second law that he second law that helps us to know that this is possible is, again, one that we can perceive even with direct perception. And we can see this in the external reality when we see that certain things are in conflict with each other. And for example, he calls it the law of contradiction. And he uses examples like heat and cold. And someone brought up last time that actually heat is just like a variation of cold. And it is true, the molecules are moving slower or faster, but there's a difference between molecules that are moving fast and ones that are moving slow. The ones that are moving fast are more heated, and the ones that are moving slow are less heated. And you can tell a difference. There's a difference between hot and cold, and when something's hot, it's not cold. So these are contradictory. Or like lightness and darkness. So it doesn't mean they're unrelated. It just means that they're distinct from each other, and one automatically diminishes the other. That's kind of the idea. He's not using the word force in a physics way. He's using it more in a kind of like, I think, just a manner of speech. Like when you have something that's hot and you do something to it to make it cold, the force of what you've done makes it cold. So it's using the word in that way, because that came up last time. Anyway, so sometimes this happens gradually, like if you're heating something up, like water, it happens gradually. Or sometimes things happen quickly, like you turn on a light switch and now you've gone from darkness to light. So here we want to look more at the mental world, though. And we can see that in our minds and our hearts, there's many opposing forces, you might say. And so you can tell that when you encourage certain kinds of emotions, you get certain kinds of results, and they actually work against other kind of emotions. So you can change the intensity of various emotions by this process. So for example, most of us here are familiar that you can't really have moments of anger at the same time you're having moments of loving kindness, right? Things like that. Or maybe pride, when your mind has a lot of pride in it, you wouldn't have a humble mind. Or maybe when you're feeling appreciative, you wouldn't have a mind that was having ingratitude, just taking things for granted, right? Or maybe when your mind is having contempt, you wouldn't have at that same moment respect for a thing or a situation or a person. So this is actually kind of a natural fact of our mind. And one example that I find quite useful is these things from Nagarjuna. Because he wrote, this is in the Chinese canon, he wrote about how to use the practice of generosity to reduce our afflictions. And he has these nice little verses that I still find quite helpful. There's 14 of them. And the one I picked out today to kind of exemplify this point is one, so you have a mind of giving, so already you're in a place of delight, right? Because that's what giving is about, taking delight in giving. So already your mind's in somewhat of a good place, hopefully. And then you become aware of another's fine meritorious qualities. And by doing that, you get rid of a lack of consideration for others. And so, like when I have a lot of afflictions in my mind, sometimes I read this sheet, and this is the one that I found just stood out to me. Like I was realizing that, wow, what's going on with my mind? I'm not really on top of it here, and I'm not very happy, and it's dragging on. So, and I can't quite get to the bottom of it. And then I just sometimes pull out this sheet and I start playing with them. And this one pops out to me. It's like, yeah, it became quite clear to me that when you have consideration for others, you're actually it's easy to do that when you see people in a positive light. And when you see people's fine meritorious qualities, you're usually thinking well of them. And so when I'm not getting along sometimes with people, I have to see that in my mind, I'm really in some way not really taking the whole person in. I'm focused on some little thing that's bothering me, and I'm forgetting like 99% of what else this person is, or a situation. It doesn't matter, these apply to situations too, but in terms of this, it has a lot to do with our relationship with others. So these are a little more nuanced, I find, than just love and anger. Or like where I first learned this was when I was working with jealousy some years ago, and I couldn't get the traditional antidote to work, which was to rejoice. But I was too angry to rejoice. so what the antidote I found in here was more suitable for my mind. And because it had just a different nuance, but it still is the same principle of these two contradictory states of mind aren't going to happen at the same time. So do you follow the point? Okay. So then His Holiness explains this a little bit further, like, okay, so this helps us see there's the possibility of change, and there are different kinds of thoughts and emotions that are directly contradictory to each other, so you wouldn't have them at the same time. But which one is the true way of looking at the state of our world? What's a false way of relating to the world? And I think this is quite an important question. This is something that I will explain it as he does. I still find myself questioning this sometimes, but he has one point in here that I hadn't heard before, and it made some sense to me. So he's basically, His Holiness explains that our thoughts and emotions that are constructive, they're actually grounded in experience and in reasoning. And because of that, they're the ones that have the truth on their side. Whereas when you look at your mind when it's angry, for example, you're exaggerating the negative qualities of something at least 80%, they say, maybe more, who knows. And those, when you look at it, that's not a stable base. So basically what happens is no matter how powerful any negative emotion is, they're actually unstable. Not just because they're impermanent, all things are changing all the time, but these aren't even on a solid foundation. They don't have reasoning behind them. And although we have experience of negative emotions, if you look at your experience in terms of what brings you happiness and what brings you suffering, once you can see this, it's quite clear that the negative emotions make you miserable and the positive emotions contribute to your well-being. So that we can also at some point have in our own experience. So these, so His Holiness goes on to say that these have the long-term effects of virtuous emotions and thoughts are much longer lasting. They're different in how their long-term effects are. So what he's trying to say is that sometimes we might have a negative emotion that seems to give us some short-term benefit, but in the long run, it ends up being negative for us. Like sometimes when you're angry, you feel very powerful, and that takes you out of a feeling of hopelessness, right? But where does your anger actually get you? It's not helpful in the long term. It's maybe a short-term relief of a feeling of hopelessness or something, or fear. So then once you start to see that with these various destructive emotions, then you're like shedding some kind of intelligence, or I would even say wisdom, upon your own experience. And then you can see that destructive emotions don't have this kind of support that would be long lasting or having long term benefits. And for this reason, he says ultimately that the wholesome, constructive, positive, virtuous emotions are more powerful than the negative ones. So their potential for development is much greater. And to me, that was one thing I'd never really heard before, that thinking about why is it that we can have limitless compassion or limitless love? It's not just because there are limitless beings, because we could have limitless beings that we were angry at, but it's actually that the foundation of the wholesome emotions is solid, and because of that, you can just keep building upon it. It's never going to crash. Whereas with the negative ones, think about it. I mean, I just think about people who have, um, I had learned something about Hitler. It just like I don't think you could live the way he lived and not at some point have your life just kind of implode on you. You know, your mind at some point it wouldn't be able to last, I don't think. And he was definitely, there's some newer uh, material about him that he actually was taking all kinds of drugs intravenously for many years of everything he was doing, various kinds of drugs that propped him up, so to speak. But eventually, he as an individual crashed as well, committing suicide. So, yeah, you don't need such a dramatic example, but just looking in our own lives, I can see that this makes a lot of sense to me. When I think of my own anger, how far that can go, what I can build with that, what I can do with that in my life is very, very limited. It's going to just remove me from anything that's worthwhile. And then when I think of any amount of compassion I've ever had, I see that that's like quite a solid basis to start building something that could go without any kind of limit. So I think it makes a lot of sense. It's starting to sink in a little bit. So these are two ways that help us to understand intellectually, but then we have to see them in our own experience. So I would invite you to think about these more, and as things come up, try to hold on to this state of mind and see how long you can make it last, or try to see, what do you think? How far can you go with this kind of emotion? Where it's going to lead to? What are the short and long-term benefits? And what do you think? Is this valid? Is this based on reasoning, or what's happening in your mind? And use it that way, not just like, oh, nice ideas, and let's close the book. And